3 years ago I built this computer. Every component in the computer was top of the line at the time and is still going strong. The only thing I don't like is the tacky ass case. At the time it was cool with all the fins and the mesh, but it just seems like a cheap child's case now. It doesn't do all the expensive components inside justice with a cheap busted up case. As you can see, from moving it from my dorm to my home many times, it has taken a beating. The side panel has cracked and is full of scratches, and the front plastic has a plastic chunk taped on. So I began researching for a new case. I wanted a more enclosed case with less fans. This case with all 4 fans and all the mesh and holes creates a lot of noise, and with it being in a dorm room, it can't really be hidden or put aside. I also wanted a full side panel with RGB lighting. This case has blue lights built into the fans. This is an annoyance because they can't ever be changed or turned off. We will be watching a movie in the dorm room with blue lights lighting up half the room, and the fan's noise doesn't help when trying to listen to the movie. Also, the side fan has a filter that collects way too much dust. Doesn't look very nice. So here's my criteria for a new case. Clean and professional looking, full side panel, no unnecessary holes in the case to have no sound leaks, and no HDD and CD drive racks. CDs are pretty much obsolete in my opinion, and some new cases can mount SSDs in the back, so I wanted that stuff removed for better airflow and water cooling support in the future. So I first bought the Fractal Design Define S case. It has everything I want. I first took it out of the box and I noticed it had a faded mark on the front panel. When you take that panel off, you can see a burn mark on the back. This faded mark is exactly where the burn is on the opposite side. I thought this was a defect on my specific unit, but no, this is on every single one. I looked at pictures online and other people's YouTube videos, and you can clearly see the burn and the mark on the front. Now I realize this isn't a huge issue, but the case's sole purpose is to hold all of the computer's components and to look sexy as hell. There should be 0 marks and fades on the outside of the case. And I ain't gonna take that bullshit. So I sent back the case and found this beauty. This piece of perfection is called the Phanteks Enthoo Evolv. It is more expensive than the Define S, but so much better in almost every way. The Define S is $80 where the Enthoo Evolv is $180. But if you can cough up the extra cash for this case, do it. Alright, so now that you have your new case, you need to move every component from your old case into your new one. So I first grabbed these tools, but I think I ended up only using the Phillips screwdriver. Now you can start removing whatever you'd like, there's no real proper way. I started removing the PCI devices first. This includes my sound card, Wi-Fi card, and my graphics card. Try to set these down on an anti-static surface. A tile floor worked fine for me. I try to stay away from carpets, blankets, or towels. Less prevention of static shock, the better. Next, I unplugged the power supply cables and removed the power supply itself. With those components out of the way, we can start removing all of the cables. This includes the power supply, SATA cables, fan cables, and the case cables. Now at this point we can start to remove the motherboard, and because we're putting the same components in a new case, we don't need to remove the heatsink, processor, or memory. Now at this point I just had the SSDs and hard drives left to remove, and here are all the components dangerously set on the floor waiting to be stepped on. Once I had all the components out of the case, I used an air compressor to clean each component. It's especially important to clean the CPU and the GPU's fans and heatsink. Now that everything is out and cleaned, we can start to put the components into the new case. One thing I forgot about is the motherboard cover plate. I screwed in the whole motherboard before I remembered I never put the cover plate in, so make sure you pop that in first. The motherboard is pretty difficult to put in. I found the easiest ways to hold the CPU heatsink to put it in. The case doesn't really give you enough room to hold the motherboard on both sides. It's probably not the safest thing to do, but it worked. Once you got the motherboard in, it's just plugging things in at this point. I always like to spend extra time on cable management and making the inside look clean, especially since the case has a large window on the side panel. The first cable is for the USB 3.0 ports on the front of the case. On my motherboard, it is right above the SATA ports. The cable is very stiff, so be aware. It was tough to get in the position it is in now. We will now move to the bottom of the motherboard to plug in the HD audio cable. This is for the headphone and microphone jacks in the front of the case. Now keep in mind these cables are labeled on the motherboard as well as the cable itself. Next is the hard drive LED and the reset switch cable. This little farm of metal prongs is nicely labeled, so make sure you get the positive and negative prongs touching the positive and negative ends of the cable. Next is the power switch, and lastly the positive and negative power LED cables. By the end, yours should look something like this. Next thing to tackle is the CPU fan and the case fans. Now I first moved the two front case fans up to the top. Originally, the bottom fan was in the basement to put cool air on the hard drive rack and then the power supply. But because I only have one hard drive down there, it really doesn't need much cooling, and my power supply is pulling cool air from the ground and then exhausting it out the back. So it doesn't need another fan on it. So this means I can focus all airflow in the top compartment of the case. The top fan pulls cool air right into the CPU fan, and the CPU fan pushes the hot air right into the back case fan. The bottom fan pulls cool air right into the GPU, and since my GPU is a reference card, it has a closed cooler design, so it exhausts the hot air out of the back. Now the Phanteks cases have a PWM fan controller in the back. All of these case fans are plugged into it by default. If you want to take advantage of the fan controller, you need to plug in the labeled cable into the CPU fan port on your motherboard. You would need to plug the CPU fan into the fan controller using an extended cable. I don't need to do this because the port I plugged my CPU fan into is a PWM port. The PWM ports and controller allows you to control your fan speed through the BIOS. The BIOS changes the fan speed for every fan connected to the controller, but you cannot change each individual fan speed. It is all one speed. Since I have my CPU fan in a separate PWM port on my motherboard, I can control my CPU fan separate of the case fans. Since silence is a goal of mine, I set my CPU fan and fan controller to 75. This setting kept my computer relatively quiet while still keeping the system plenty cool while under load. One thing to keep in mind too is that the fan controller will be labeled as CPU fan in the BIOS, and my CPU fan is labeled as a system fan. Also, the white port on the fan controller is the fan that the BIOS monitors for its RPM speed. The BIOS does not monitor the RPM speed for every fan in the fan controller. Now that the fans are set up, I just needed to put in the power supply, replug in all the needed cables, and install my 500 gigabyte SSD for my operating system and my 1.5 terabyte hard drive for my games and videos. The second SSD in the back is just an extra one I have for messing around with my school laptop, so I don't have it plugged in right now. So now the computer is finished, booted up fine and works like a charm. But I wasn't finished. It still needed the RGB lighting that I stated earlier, so I purchased the NZXT Hue Plus lighting kit. I installed the unit in the second hard drive bay above my hard drive. I then plugged one cable from the Hue into a USB port on my motherboard and the other into a SATA port for my power supply. Then I put the strips around the side panel like so. At this point you just need to download their CAM software from their website. And let me tell you, this kit is worth the $60. It is such a great upgrade from the blue fan lights I had before. You have so many lighting options. Since the room I have my computer in has so many orange lights, I made the lighting dark orange with the candle effect on so it mimics the candles in the room perfectly. That's all that I did for my computer upgrade this time around. I hope you all enjoyed, and thank you so much for watching.